Mr. Chatra, if we look at unemployment and job security as one of the key pillars when it comes to having a Viksit Bharat by 2047, having a 5 trillion economy, say, by 2027, how crucial, fundamentally, instrumental are some of these minor tweaks when it comes to attracting the youth of this nation to invest, enroll, and apply?
I think, first of all, to say that those are welcome steps. And it's important that it is also a message that we want to grow the formal sector. And therefore, the benefits of EPFO, which you were counting in great detail, which are quite huge, and I think it's a great option, should be available to them. But let's also remember, Vinitji, that EPFO and all of those facilities that we've talked of today, the employee, sort of employment incentive kind of things that we're talking of, employment linked incentives, and they're welcome steps for a large chunk of our population, aspirational chunk of our population. But let's also remember there's a whole chunk of people who can never avail in the current context, until they're formalized, avail the services of such social security facilities. Let's take the case of gig workers. Can a gig worker, whose numbers are only growing, can a gig worker, a platform worker, an Amazon worker, actually get to EPFO? No. Can a construction worker, eking out a solitary livelihood in the labor markets of the city, get to EPFO? Can an agricultural worker, farming, working for some farmer, tilling the land without land, himself or herself, get to EPFO? So I think we must recognize there's a whole set of people who are outside of this formal pale. That's one big issue that I want to sort of put it on the table here. The other big factor, if you look at industrialization itself, and if you look at trends within industry, if you note the last 20 years or so, there has been a trend towards contractualization of workforce, both in the private sector, and the numbers are there. If you look at annual survey of industries, data from 2002-3 to data in 2022, 21, 22, 22, 23, you will find that the numbers of contractual workers are only growing, which therefore means they stood at some 23% in 2002-3 in the same survey, and in the last years they've stood at around 40%. So there's a rapid expansion of contractualization and even outsourcing of work. Now, what is contractualization of work in private sector as well as in public sector? Railways, for instance, and many other public sectors, defense, for instance. So there it's sub-employment. So what you have for a formal worker is not what you have for what is called a contractualized worker. Security of job tenures, the social security benefits he or she gets, EPFO benefits that he or she gets. So you get into a sub-employment trajectory with reference to contractualized and outsourced workers. So this trend must be arrested, because if you continue in this trend, irrespective of absorption in industry, you find that people will not be able to avail the kind of benefits and decent benefits that you have. My third point and the third challenge that we need to address is this whole question of wages. You were pointing to opposition raising this issue. It is a substantive issue. Growth in wages has been low. The International Labour Organization says that the growth of wages, particularly for lower income groups and even for middle income groups, for India.
Mr. Chatra, it obviously takes a lot of effort to please everyone, but the fact of the matter is that employment, skilling, and the poor, has the government missed, or has there been a hit in terms of the longevity of the process that they have undertaken at this point in time?
I think the vision is clearly set. I think the great transformation towards Viksit Bharat and the 9 steps outlined by the Honorable Finance Minister today, beginning with agriculture, beginning with rural focus, and ending with what's called the next generation reforms. I think that gives a broad visionary step. I think it's a hit in terms of where it focuses attention on the popular classes of India. And that is the reason why, as Deepak ji was speaking in another context, the stock markets temporarily fell. I'm sure they'll rise again. But I think there is a clear message that the message, I mean, of course, there are lots of gaps, there are debates that we are doing, but the message is very clear that we care. We care for rural India, we care for working people, we care for youth of India. So I think in the headlines, that's the messaging I see, and that's the reason I welcome this announcement in this budget today. You can argue that this responds to a very closely fought election and the predominant social messaging in the election on employment, on jobs, on rural development, on farmers. So you can argue that. You can argue that, and I think it's a good argument, that some of the ideas that Congress had in its manifesto are taken up. It's welcome. It's taken up. And I think the best ideas need to be taken up. So one can argue that, and I think I would like to respond to your earlier question in that spirit. So I think overall, this is the right direction. Strong efforts are needed. There's a focus, for instance, on the still much more efforts are needed. Let me put it that way. There's a focus, for instance, on the National Research Fund, the Innovation Fund. There's a focus, for instance, on climate adaptation and mitigation and green transitions. The right words, the right messages, and words are important messages of the direction of travel. And I think the budget's done that, the announcements have done that, but it needs to be, sort of backed up with numbers, with allocations, with strong allocations, with methodologies to ensure those allocations are accountable and implemented on the ground. And I think they are measurable and also measurable year on year, because in the end, budgets are annual statements. So in the end, there is an allocation and there is an accountability towards that allocation and outcome for that allocation.
Right.
So mere announcements are not just is what can be only celebrated. So one has to measure, and I think these are welcome steps in that spirit, Vinitji.